Welcome to The Great Awakening. I'm your host, Josh Daws. Today on the show, I have the tapper of signs himself, Auron MacIntyre. Auron is a political analyst for The Blaze. He has a really extraordinary YouTube channel where he does political analysis and has great guests. Auron's got a remarkable ability to explain what's going on in our culture and in politics in a way that really, I think, understands better than most what's happening right now. And he's not just able to understand it, but he can explain it really, really well. So he's definitely someone you should be following if you're not. On Twitter, Auron is known for his memes where he has the Simpsons bus driver saying, "Don't make me tap that sign." And then one of Auron's tweets is usually on the bottom half, a close-up of the sign. So it was one of Auron's tweets that was really popular a year ago that I kind of springboarded off of in creating a thread explaining why the left wants to talk to your kids about sexuality. Really boosted the channel here, boosted the podcast and my followers on Twitter. So I'm really grateful to him for giving me that to springboard off of. So we talk about that a little bit. And then we, talk a bit about the shooting in Nashville this past week as of this recording. So it's maybe a heavier episode, in parts than some of my episodes. So if you're listening with kids, it might not be one you want to listen while they're around, but it's a great conversation. I think you're really going to enjoy it. So let's jump right into that conversation with Auron. Hey, Auron, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
So first off, I want to thank you for creating the "It's Not Rocket Science" meme, which I was able to spring off of about a year ago with a thread kind of explaining why the left wants to talk to our kids about sexuality. It's at the time of the parental rights and education bill came out. And I think a lot of conservatives were kind of questioning, like, what is going on? Why is this such a big priority for the left right now? And I don't think a lot of people, some conservatives were not quite ready to go with the suggestion you offered that it's not rocket science. They're just evil and they want to diddle kids. So I tried to kind of explain how a lot of good people kind of get sucked up into pushing this agenda. And over the past year, as this is just elevated and we've seen it just really take on a life of its own with the drag queen, family friendly drag shows and such. I've released an addendum on Friday that a lot of them are in fact evil and want to damage kids. So why is this such a flashpoint in our culture, in the culture war right now?
Well, I think your thread was great because it did take a lot of the technical aspects, a lot of the things that people needed to understand about what's happening in our culture. And that is the assault on the family. Any totalitarian state eventually has to destroy the family because the family is kind of the last natural barrier between the total state and control of the populace. The family is the most organic formation of kind of social bonds, one that's pretty much inescapable. You might eventually be able to get people away from church or community, but everybody has a mother or a father pretty much. And so it's something that if you're seeking totalizing control of a culture, you absolutely have to destroy. And because we have created a narrative of the civil rights revolution in the United States, and that is kind of an unassailable narrative, it means that anything that can attach itself to the moral authority of that movement can pretty much do whatever it wants. It can circumvent constitutional rights. It can obliterate longstanding traditional bonds. And it is now being used as a weapon to kind of destroy the family. And so they are of course in the family, and they're indoctrinating children very young. They're making sure to shift their understanding of their identity. They're making sure to make them understand that their parents are their enemies, that their parents are backwards and subversive and shouldn't be trusted, that only agents of the state can be trusted to defend them against kind of their parochial and backward parents. But also the really difficult truth that I understand why a lot of people, don't want to look at, is that the natural consequence of this is to make children vulnerable to predation. And while you are exactly right to point out that not everybody involved with this, of course, not even the majority of people involved in this, directly are interested in preying on children, they are actively involved in making children more vulnerable to sexual abuse and predation. And of course, we will naturally see a rise in that as it's made easier because children are taken from the protection of their parents and placed in a situation where they're vulnerable and they've been exposed to sexuality far too young. And as anyone who is ever familiar with how sexual trafficking works, the first thing people who do want to traffic young children or teens is expose them to sexuality too young. And so we're doing exactly that on a civilizational wide scale.
Yeah. The thing that's been just so incredible to me is how how quickly it's escalated and how comfortable the left has been in defending what just 2 years ago would have been indefensible. You had a video about the attack on innocence. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, at every stage of this kind of revolution, we've seen the cycle increase, right? So you think about how long it took to normalize something like kind of public acceptance of alternative sexualities. And then the much shorter cycle it took to normalize the redefinition of marriage. And now we've gone from, Barack Obama and Joe Biden saying that marriage is between a man and woman in 2006 and 2008 to the Republican Party now redefining marriage, Republican senators saying that. It's not surprising, unfortunately, that each one of these cycles gets faster and faster and faster and becomes more and more shocking, because once the barriers are removed, there's no reason that, there's no moral barrier between this and the next radicalization. And because, again, of our framework of the civil rights revolution, we understand that, like, to normalize and build acceptance, you have to teach it to children young. It makes perfect sense in many different ways. And if you're going to teach it to children very young, and the normal thing you're normalizing is sexual behavior, then you must, by necessity, teach children sexual behavior at a younger an age. And this is why we're seeing, this stuff being pushed down, into elementary schools, into kindergarten, because this is the very basic delivery method with which we kind of normalize and eventually build to praising this type of behavior. And so you, by necessity, must rob children of their innocence. They must be introduced to these concepts at a younger and younger age in order to normalize behavior that, let's be really brutally honest here, is just objectively disgusting and is objectively going to trigger a repulse mechanism. No one just normally wants to see a transgender stripper exposing themselves to children. That builds that's a very natural disgust. It's a healthy disgust. You should as a parent see all kinds of red flags and warning bells when this happens. So to normalize this to children, to make it something that's not weird, that's not strange, you have to expose it to them younger and younger. You have to rob them of innocence in order to make sure that kind of this increasingly obscure, vanishingly small minority becomes a normal thing that everyone embraces and celebrates.
Why do you think there's a reluctance from conservatives to call this what it is, to call this evil? You have people like David French that are, seem to just bend over backwards to extend good faith to the left, and can't call it what it is.
I think it's very difficult for us especially as Christians who want to live in a society where we are extending grace and goodwill to everyone around us, understandably, and should if possible. But I think a lot of us have taken for granted that we lived in Christendom, that the society we lived in wasn't magical and it didn't arise out of nowhere. It was a hard fought achievement of our ancestors. And unfortunately, because we assumed it was just kind of the baseline structure of reality, we have let it atrophy, as anything does when it's untended. We just kind of assumed that the basic, assumptions of Christendom would continue, and the basic social fabric and allowances could be made. It's hard for us to really, truly grasp that a society could completely embrace evil, and it shouldn't be, because the Bible's full of societies that did that, including, God's own chosen when they went astray. So it's something that everyone, including even God's children, can directly fall prey to. But we had it really hard because we had it so good for so long. It's really hard for us, I think, to understand that we're just not in that realm anymore. And David French is just committed to never understanding that realm, because really the process of it, the Constitution built around it, has become far more important than the religion and culture and people that made it possible. And whenever you're worshiping the process as opposed to that which made the process possible, then you'll inevitably miss really important parts of what's happening around you.
Yeah. Yeah. And unfortunately, this past week, we had a tragic example of where this all seems to be building to. As we record this, a week ago, there was a 28-year-old woman who went into Covenant Christian School in Nashville and killed 3 children and 3 adults, presumably because it was a Christian school that this woman, who is now identifying as a transgender man, went in. And it's been really something to see the media's response to this. Just 24 hours later, we're getting, sympathetic stories about, this woman's upbringing and how her parents weren't supportive of her transgender identity. What do you make of the response to this?
Yeah, it's obviously horrific and shocking, and you desperately wish that we lived in a society where we could all just be really human and compassionate about this and just collectively grieve over what happened here and feel for the sorrow of the parents and the victims and the community that's deeply impacted by this. And as gross as it is, there's really no way to avoid the fact that unfortunately we just can't be there, because we are in such a clash of moral visions that one side can't even stop their relentless assault on their cultural enemies for a moment when children are dead. It's a terrible place to be. It's an almost unimaginable place to be, but here we are, and unfortunately it's the time that we have to live in. It just kind of unmasks. I think everyone knew. I think Christians are familiar with the fact that the media doesn't like them, that they kind of hate them, that popular culture looks down on and despises them. I think Christians have kind of become aware of the fact that they're no longer welcome in the broader culture in a lot of ways. But I think it was another thing to see the media truly celebrate. And let's not sugarcoat it. They're not even particularly careful with their words. They're celebrating this. They are. One of my friends on Twitter made a really excellent point. He said, normally we all know how this game works. Someone from a favored class of the left shoots up a place, and suddenly, instead of being about ideology, it's about guns, right? Gun control, gun control, gun control. And left easily could have done that again. They could have completely ignored the identity of the shooter and just made this all about gun control. But the really shocking thing is that they didn't. They embraced the identity of the shooter. They talked ad nauseum about the identity of the shooter. They bent over backgrounds to get the right pronouns, to correct law enforcement, make sure they had the right pronouns. The Mirror wrote a glowing article about how the shooter was just this lost future, this lost promise that could have become, a children's book illustrator because her drawings were so whimsical. They were glorifying and celebrating. We saw protesters storm state capitals to talk about the horrible things that those states had done to trans people instead of talking about the victims of this thing. We saw them literally say, oh, there were 7 victims. Why? Because they wanted to make it clear that the trans shooter mattered, that was really important to celebrate the trans shooter. And that means you're in a whole new ballgame. You're really, it's very, when Madonna goes out and responds to a trans shooter by raising money for trans causes, the message is really clear. If you go and shoot Christian kids, we're going to go raise money on your behalf. We're going to shower your favorite group with sympathy and praise and funding. And that's a really, of course, insane and dangerous place to be. And the media is really unapologetic about embracing that, which, again, there's really not enough words to talk about how evil it is, but also how shocking it is. Again, everyone knew kind of where the media stood, but it's another thing to just watch them wish death on kids. It's another world.
Yeah. As Christians, we believe what Jesus said, that if they hated me, they're going to hate you. And we know that we've been promised persecution and suffering, but I think we've just been living in such a, like you said, Christendom for so long. It was something we imagined, happening in China or, on the other side of the globe, but to see it here in, in the Bible Belt, it's really jarring. And I think it's, I'm hopeful that it's going to wake a lot of Christians up that have been reluctant to call evil evil and to really oppose this ideology. You have another kind of saying you're known for on Twitter, that it's not hypocrisy, it's hierarchy. And just really talking to how the left or how the conservatives like to point out, well, imagine if the scenario was reversed. Just think of how the response would be different. But you're saying that it's not hypocrisy. It's intentional. They're demonstrating their our place in the hierarchy.
Yeah, credit to Adrian Vermeule who coined that. But I've used it enough where people kind of assume it's mine. But it's a really good quote because it really puts in stark contrast what's happening. It's so often conservatives and Christians have pointed out the hypocrisy of someone, again, assuming that they live in a culture where everyone shares the same basic value, the same basic moral vision. And so once you kind of point out that someone is violating the moral vision, that they're violating the rules, that they're working against the shared common understanding of decency, then obviously they'll be embarrassed and the community will compel them to change their behavior because that's how cohesive culture works. But we don't have that. That's not what's happening here. We've allowed that again to decay, and we allowed progressives to capture many, and if not all, of the institutions that enforce both legal and cultural consequences when it comes to the era of moral visions. And so when they grant special privileges to their people, whether it's the ability to say, storm a state capitol and interrupt the legislature without, like, say, going to prison for 4 years, like January 6th protesters are sentenced to, what they're doing is not creating some kind of hypocrisy, and you're not going to shame them into their action. What they want is everyone to understand the rules. And the rules are, we have special privileges, you don't. The Constitution doesn't protect you. That's not what happens here. There's a new rule, and we are the ones who benefit from that rule, and you as our opponents are punished by that rule. And again, as Christians and many conservative constitutionalists, a lot of us are a lot of those things go hand in hand in America, especially in the evangelical community. It's really hard for us to grasp that there's another political reality out there. But we really do have to understand that we are no longer in a scenario where one cultural vision dominates, or at least our cultural vision dominates. And we can't take on the culture war or any other aspect of our lives with the assumption that that kind of background Christian morality will be the one that rules.
Yeah, it's really telling to me that the rainbow flag, what do conquering armies do when they conquer a nation, or a city? The first thing they do is they raise their flag. And I think it's important for Christians to start recognizing that we, in a lot of ways, are living in a conquered culture that is no longer, sharing those same common core values, and we need to start thinking about that differently. The thing as I think Christians are kind of waking up to our situation, I think there's a reluctance to kind of entertain, to be able to step outside of kind of the frames we've all grew up with. That democracy is good, that liberalism, classical liberalism is the ideal that we need to aspire to. How would you kind of encourage someone to kind of step outside of their received frames for a little bit, to kind of start re-examining some of that stuff? Where should they start?
I think you should actually start with the founding fathers. I think that's a great place for people to start, because it's someone they trust and they understand, and it is kind of core to their understanding. But often they don't think about what the founding fathers said. So I think Christians and conservatives in general are pretty quick to quote the founding fathers when they said things like, Constitution is only good for, governing people who follow the 10 Commandments. It only works when it's governing a moral people who fear God. You can throw out a bunch of different quotes from all kinds of different founding fathers along those lines. But the thing that Christians and conservatives often don't think about is, okay, but if we aren't those people anymore, if the public is no longer that, then what does that mean? Well, then it means the Constitution can't govern those people anymore, right? That's the very obvious implication. And that's a terrifying thing for people to think about. But it's already the case. Like, whether you like it or not, it's very clear the Constitution doesn't govern you anymore. If the Constitution did govern you, then they wouldn't have arrested your pastor during COVID for trying to hold church services while they left the liquor stores and abortion clinics open. Like, you just need to be very real about the situation you live in. Like, you are not governed by the Constitution, and the very body politic in which the Constitution is supposed to govern has changed. And the founding fathers themselves told you exactly what would happen if that occurred. And so I think then, as people who probably find ourselves still very attached to the values and history and tradition of America in general, and obviously very attached to the living faith of Christianity, then we have to ask ourselves, okay, if this is no longer what governs us, and this is no longer the situation we live in, then kind of where are we at? Now, of course, you can look, I think, to someone like Augustine, who wrote The City of God, as Rome was falling, and as civilization and Christendom, as he had understood it, was kind of collapsing around him. And if you want to understand where church fathers and Christians in the past how they have understood events like this, which have happened before, then you have a very Christian resource to do that. But if you also want to understand like the more raw political, mechanical forms of it, there's also political analysis that I think is very valuable. There's books like The Machiavellians by James Burnham, which explains, I think, the very real political mechanisms that are affecting our current situation. And so it's kind of both. You can arm yourself with a Christian understanding of the events we're going through, but you can also understand in a very real political way, kind of what's going on.
Yeah. Is there any path forward within our current system and within our current institutions? Can we recapture the institutions?
It's a very difficult discussion. Many people would like to do kind of the reverse long march of the institutions, right? The Gramscian long march. They came through and infiltrated all of these institutions in Western civilization, and converted them to Marxism, and kind of created our situation we're in. And we'd say, well, we could do the same thing. I understand people wanting to do that. And I don't blame people who try, but I don't know that things work the same way, because one of the key parts that kind of progressives were preying upon was the goodwill of, I think, the wider Christian liberal culture, its openness to ideas, and the idea of persuasion. You'll notice that liberals used to talk a lot about free speech, talk a lot about the rights of protest and all this kind of thing. And now they're really excited about jailing people for making memes, and they want to get anyone who has any kind of opposing opinion fired from their job, from academia, and so the progressives are not as foolish. They're not going to leave that ladder down for us in the same way.
Mhm.
Also, it's very difficult to change the culture of these institutions, because in many ways they are designed from the ground up to eventually move leftward, which is kind of a longer conversation. But if people want to understand the mechanics of that, I've got a couple different videos on my YouTube channel kind of explaining how that works. But I think really what we have to do is shift our mindset from one of conserving to one of building. We can't continue, either as cultural conservatives or as Christians, to assume that the culture around us just has our values as background radiation, right? Like I just did a piece about, there's a Wall Street Journal poll, and it had less than 40% of the country was interested in patriotism, thought that religion was very important to them, having children, kind of like not just American values, but like really basic civilizational
Mhm.
values. Not the majority of the country is no longer interested in those things. And so rather than saying, well, we're conserving what these institutions stand for, because actually they no longer stand for any of those things, they've all been subverted, they've all been changed. I think we need to shift our mentality as being people who are culturally insurgent. You are no longer the dominant culture, and so you must understand that you are not conserving the dominant culture, you are building a new one. You are
Yeah.
changing the paradigm, you are not protecting it. And that means building new institutions. That means building new cultural artifacts. That means creating networks that allow people to live in existence in this culture that is separate from the ideology that dominates it. And I think that's a really important shift for us going forward.
Yeah, and I think that's really one of the I think the best things churches can be focused on right now is helping Christians to kind of step out of that cultural stream that is swiftly moving left, and not just making decisions because everyone around them is making those same decisions, but to really think about how best to order our lives as Christians living in a hostile culture. Like it can't look like what your life looked like growing up, or otherwise it's just surrendering to what's happening. Um, any advice to kind of evangelical leaders where you'd like to see them get to on this? How can they help kind of shepherd Christians in this new world that we're facing?
Yeah, I'm always careful, because while obviously I think that religion and politics are inseparable, that all political differences are ultimately theological questions. I try not to tell spiritual leaders so much what to do, because at the end of the day, I am a political analyst, and this is where my wheelhouse is. So I can only speak as somebody who is a Christian and goes to a church, and things I would like to see, and things that would help me personally. And of course, one of those things is, while maintaining compassion and maintaining outreach, you have to be able to speak boldly and plainly about the evil that's happening around you. You can't turn away from it because it's uncomfortable, and you can't turn away from it because people might not donate, and you can't turn away from it because people might leave. If your church isn't speaking out about this, then of what value is your church? Not because of my political position, or not because of my political preferences or anyone else's, but because of God's word, and because you simply cannot watch something like the mutilation of children as a Christian silently. That's just unacceptable on any level. At the same time, I think it's also really important, however, to guard what the church is, and the church is not a political institution. And I don't want to go to church and hear the political preferences of my preacher every day or every Sunday, because ultimately churches should be focused on higher things. You know, we don't want every aspect, every social sphere to be completely dominated. And so there's this really fine line of speaking the truth and saying what has to be said and what I think Christ would want said on an issue, without turning your sermon into a political platform. But this also, of course, is, that's only what's coming from the pulpit. You also need to look at, okay, if we're an insurgent culture, we're no longer the dominant culture. What do minority cultures do to protect their beliefs and their ways of life? Well, they start schools that their kids go to separately, whether it's Catholic or Jewish or Islamic. If you're in a majority Christian country and you want those cultures to be protected, you don't send your kids to Christian school. You send your kids to the school that actually protects your values. And so I think education and child rearing has to become a really essential part of the church, not just the school itself, but give families, particularly mothers, ways to raise their children and protect their children from this ideology. Many mothers in our world, even in the Christian church, are atomized. They don't feel a community of other women around them to help them build. We don't have that multi-generational social fabric of your aunts, your sisters, your mother, everyone's around helping you raise the children. And so these women feel alone. They're left alone to try to inform the morality and culture and beliefs of their children. I think it's really important for churches to find ways to connect families and connect especially mothers, but entire families, so that they're not raising their children in kind of a wasteland of progressive ideology with one kind of home battling against the whole thing. I think you have to build a stronger fabric.
Yeah, that's good. That's something we started homeschooling during COVID. Our kids were at a private Christian school before then, but just the community you get from other like-minded parents who see the crazy around you, and you don't feel so alone. And I think that's a huge one, especially for moms that can feel all alone when they're in the trenches. The other thing that I would love to see churches, I think churches are going to have to start thinking about is, we may not, I don't think you're going to see just yet a rash of, terrorists, storming churches and opening fire. Although who knows at this point, but I do think you're going to see other types of more subtle attacks, or maybe activist parents start attending with their transgender son in a dress. And I think churches really need to start thinking through, like, how are we going to respond to that? I think we're so, as evangelicals, it's in our name. We're so focused on evangelism that we're really reluctant to draw any hard lines and to recognize this is a political attack. This is, they're trying to disrupt the service. They're trying to, bring in these ideas to influence, the other kids in Sunday school. And I think pastors really need to think through ahead of time before that situation happens. How are we going to handle this? What are we going to do?
Yeah, I would be less sure, unfortunately, tragically, about kind of your first point there. But to your second one, it's absolutely correct. I mean, churches have to think about this beforehand. You can't wait until this issue pops up and it's charged and there's people on both sides. You need to draw these lines brightly and clearly before they happen. There's of course the saying, preaching to the choir. The idea being that the choir doesn't need, they're already so committed, they're already so pious, they already understand that you don't need to spend time with them. That's really stupid. Like, when you have a world around you, when you have a culture around you that is relentlessly assaulting every aspect of your Christianity, you've got to feed the body of Christ. You cannot, and you have to understand that if you sacrifice the well-being, particularly of children in their formative years, thinking that like setting yourself as open and accepting so that you can welcome in some person who is completely hostile to what you're doing, you're not protecting your message. You're destroying it. And for what? For the approval, let's be honest, of people outside.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you're doing it for. No matter what, a good pastor will protect their flock. That's all there is to it, especially the children. And you have to, there will be no one to shepherd if you invite wolves into the flock. There's just nothing else to say about that. You're very right. People have to be prepared to draw bright lines and say, look, we're always here with compassion and care to go to you and help you make a change that might allow you to be in communion with the body. Mm-hmm. But that's very different than bringing you into communion with the body of Christ and forming it around the thing you refuse to change. That's not how this works.
Yeah. I sometimes, refer to that as we've made an idol of evangelism. It becomes this ultimate thing that everything else is subservient to. It's like we're not going to, and even outside of our own flocks, we're not going to stand up and protect the kids targeted by this ideology because we're so concerned with reaching the people that are promoting the ideology. And it's baffling to me that, we have so much trouble kind of distinguishing between that. And it really comes down to, we don't trust God to do the conversion. It's like we think that, evangelism is making converts. So whatever we can do to soften it, or, we act like PR managers for God that, we have to soften his rough edges and, toss out the messages that the world doesn't like so we can get people in. And then, like you said, that's just inviting wolves in.
Well, and to really piggyback on that, something that has bothered me for a very long time, is I will talk to you, because I taught public school, and so I'm very familiar. Like I taught in like Title I schools, like the worst of areas in kind of our region, and the kids there are completely unchurched. They don't know anything. You ask them anything about the Bible, the Bible, anything about just. I broke my heart one time when I had a student ask me what the word moral meant. This is not a young kid, but they did not understand the definition of the word. If you had asked them anything about just the basics of the Christmas story, they wouldn't have been able to give them to you. And then churches will send, big mission teams to Africa or Eastern Europe or something. And I'll point out to them, like, that the kid down the street from you couldn't tell you the first thing about Mary or Joseph or Bethlehem. Mm-hmm. And the response I've literally gotten from people, they're with no hesitation is, oh, well, it's really hard to convert Western people because they've already rejected the Bible. So we're just going to places that haven't heard about it because it's easier. And you're right. Like that, you're exactly right. They don't trust God to do the converting. They think that that evangelism is just a numbers game, and you should go where it's easier because then you can pick up the numbers, completely ignoring that your duty is to your community first. You go to the other nations once you've converted your nation, once you've taken care of your home, what you're responsible for, then you take it outside. But that seems to have, like you said, it's just how many numbers, how many times can we flash people up on the screen getting baptized? That's way more important than saying the kid down the street from me doesn't know about Jesus, and maybe that should be my priority.
Yeah, well, and we fall back on, relational evangelism. We're our kids play with them in the cul-de-sac, and so we're building those relationships. And maybe one day they'll ask us why about the hope that is within us. And it's like, well, they don't know that you have a hope because you don't talk about it. And really, we kind of use evangelism as an excuse, instead of, our idol is comfort. We don't want to do the hard things. We don't want to enter into those conversations when, if you're at the pool, community pool, and the, I don't know, transgender bathrooms comes up, we just smile and nod along and we don't say anything because we don't want to give up our comfort. We like, living in this culture. And I don't think anything's going to change until Christians start having, a backbone, some spine to actually step into these conversations, to talk to the kid down the street and, invite them to a church where they're going to hear the gospel. They're not just going to be sold, something that's going to make their life better, but going to be asked to, repent of their sins. And to, I think that I know many others have said the only real hope we have is revival. And I think, that's got to start in the church. The church has got to start, taking these things more seriously and taking our faith more seriously, and how that outworks into society. So, I really appreciate, what you're doing on your channel to kind of help people really think through these things. What is something that is giving you hope right now? Is there anything that, I always feel like, my podcast is like 90% black pills. And then, so I like to end it with, what is something that's giving people, giving you hope?
Well, I think that, of course, we always have hope, but I think that very specifically, I am starting to see some of that building. I am starting to see people understanding that it's not enough to sit around and wait for, our fellow countrymen to kind of, understand how they've gone astray and kind of self-correct. And so I am seeing people make changes. There are organizations out there like Exit or New Foundings that are building ways for people to stay employed, to build connections with non-woke businesses, non-woke employers, so that if they do end up without employment, or if they just want to get away from current employment that is dependent on these ideologies, there are organizations around them. It's not just stand up and speak your truth and then never be able to pay the mortgage again. Like there are people taking active steps to kind of create that network. I'm also seeing fraternal organizations like the Old Glory Club and others that are focusing on kind of American values, American founding, building a celebration of those kind of classic and traditional values in a way that builds networks. I see movements towards things like physical health, people working on getting healthier, removing themselves from just difficult lifestyles that were causing not just physical but spiritual difficulty. And I think that all of these are good focuses. I think it's good, like the politics matters, of course. I spend a lot of time talking about politics, so I'm not going to tell anyone like don't worry about politics. But I think it's really good that there's a move in kind of the political right, but hopefully this also means Christians as well, of building non-political institutions that will inevitably have downstream effects on culture and on politics. Because again, what do progressives do? What does the left do? They have tons of institutions that shelter them from the ebbs and flows of democratic politics. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if it's Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis or if it's Joe Biden or Gavin Newsom. Progressive institutions will still be there to push progressive ideas on the culture. And I think that Christians and conservatives must do the same thing. And we're starting to see, I think, a grasp of that. People understanding that it's not just about electing the next politician or changing the next law, but it's about a multi-generational recreation and of foundational institutions that will protect your culture, protect your religion, protect your values, and move them into the future.
Yeah. Do you think any of the Christian nationalism, I don't know if it's a movement. I'm not sure what it is at this point. You think there's something to that, or is that something that you think is ultimately unhelpful and Christians should stay away from?
I've warned people about the phrasing, and I say this as someone who I'm not trying to decry people who are in the Christian nationalist movement. I'm not trying to say that they're bad actors. I think many of them probably have excellent ends in mind, and they're of course exactly right to give them complete credit that our nation's laws and governments must be informed by Christian values. There's no such thing as a neutral institution. There's no such thing as a culturally neutral government. All governments are forwarding someone's values, and if they're not Christian, they will be something else. So they're right about that. However, the phrase specifically Christian nationalism, I think, was embraced by the media because, let's be honest, that's where it pretty much grew to prominence, was embraced specifically to attempt to link Christianity and very specifically white evangelicals to white nationalism. That was the rhetorical frame, I think, embraced by the media when they embraced that phrase. And so while I think most of what Christian nationalists say about the interaction between religion and Christianity and the state are true, I just think that the frame and the phrasing is a little bit dangerous. And so if you're going to use it or if you're going to approach it, you should come in with eyes wide open as to why it was embraced by the media and what their intentions were with that.
Yeah. I'm still kind of torn on it myself. On the one hand, I don't think it has as much baggage as racism or white supremacists. So on the one hand, I see it. Maybe it's a label that we can embrace and kind of turn it around and show that we're bulletproof. But on the other hand, so much of that conversation now has been about the label, and I think I'm just seeing guys like Chris Rufo and Corey DeAngelis who are actually, and even Ron DeSantis, who are just making so much progress on the ground without a label for what they're calling what they're doing, but it could fit nicely under Christian nationalism. I've been encouraging people, let's just figure out things that we can do and not worry so much about what it's called. And, hopefully we can gain some momentum and not, exclude anyone that might have a hang up about the name.
Yeah. Nationalism is explicitly political project. Christianity is a supranational thing, right? It's far more important than and exists above and can in many different nations of entirely different characters, cultures, and governmental constructions can exist under Christianity. And so that's the only thing about it that kind of bothers me in particular. I want my nation to be Christian. I want its values and its government to be entirely informed by Christian values. But I don't necessarily want Christianity used as a political poster for my political project. It's more important than that. It's an essential part of what I want my political project to be informed by, but it is far more important than my political project.
Yeah, agreed. Well, Auron, where can people find you?
Sure. They can find my stuff over at The Blaze. I write a column there, and all my stuff goes up on Blaze TV. I've also got a YouTube channel, Rumble Odyssey, if you want to use the alt text stuff. Twitter, Gab. I've got a Substack, Auron MacIntyre. You can find all that stuff there.
Excellent. Are you still writing the Total State book?
Yes, got a couple more chapters, and then it looks like there will be a publisher as well. So I've got, for people who don't know, I'm writing like these rough draft chapters of the book. But once they're done, there'll be a complete, finished and physical book available for people as well. So,
and what's that about?
It's a lot of political theory, but it's basically explaining why the Constitution and limited government and democracy, all the things that we were kind of told would keep government in check, why it has not stopped the advance of totalitarian states, and why we're watching Western liberal democracies move towards totalitarianism, even though they were supposed to be very politically different from something like communism or fascism.
Excellent. Well, I've enjoyed what you've put out so far, so I look forward to grabbing that when it comes out. Yeah, Auron, thank you so much for joining me. This has been fun.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
That's our show for today. Big thanks to Auron MacIntyre for joining me for this conversation. If you are not following him or subscribed to his YouTube channel, you have to correct that today. He is definitely someone you want to be paying attention to. I think you'll find his analysis very, very insightful and helpful. If you found this episode helpful, go ahead and share it with your friends. If you're watching on YouTube, hit like and subscribe. The channel has grown a lot the last couple of weeks, so I really appreciate everyone who is sharing the show and who is sharing these episodes, because it does make a difference. And if you're listening to the audio version, ratings and reviews at Apple Podcast are always appreciated. I would appreciate that. If you are listening as this episode comes out, I do want to also remind you about the King's Domain Conference coming up in 2 weeks in Cincinnati, Ohio. I believe the website is kings-domain.com, where you can sign up and come to that event. I'm going to be there speaking with Aaron Wren's going to be there, Michael Foster, Chase Davis, and Michael Clary is speaking as well. He's a pastor who's hosting the conference. So please, if you're going to be there, let me know. I would love to connect with you in real life. I think that's all I have for today. So until next time, I will talk to you soon.